I'm interested, and my team are interested in the human side of all of this. What does this mean for humans? What does it mean for human learning? And what can we understand about the human-machine interaction that is going to help us to get a sense of how these new technologies might help with learning? There is also increased skepticism about the role that AI might play in learning. These tools were not built for learning. Right? They were built for other purposes, productivity, marketing, and other types of activities. They were not built to help us to learn. So we need to adjust how we use it. We need to make sense of it. We need to think about the ways that it's going to impact on what we do in our learning very carefully, because there are some pretty major downsides that are emerging in terms of the impact that this technology is having on learning. Let me give you some sense of what I kind of think that this tool is, as a nice analogy that will give you a sense of what I think it does for our minds and our brains. So before there was any such thing as an e-bike, if you wanted to ride somewhere, you would ride there, and as a result of that, you would also get a little bit fitter. Right? Ride a bike, you'd have to pedal on it, and as a side effect of that, going from A to B would help you to develop your fitness. Now, e-bikes came along, and if you really want to, the good e-bikes these days, you really don't have to pedal at all. But if you think that you're going to get onto an e-bike and get fit, you're not. In the same way, learning before generative AI came along, or before some other technical tools came along, required work. Right? And that work is an important part of the process of your brain and your mind becoming better at doing what they need to do. Now we have generative AI here. You don't necessarily have to pedal in learning at all. So in many ways, your brain is kind of like your body, in that the more effort we put into our learning, the more you will get out of it. So we have to think very carefully about how we might use AI in learning so that that effort doesn't disappear. A lot of people talk about how generative AI is like a calculator. Right? It's kind of not really. Here's why. A calculator, right, can you just pick that up and use it? But if you've never been exposed to mathematics before, how are you going to know what those symbols do? But you need to understand something about mathematical operations in order to use a calculator. Right? In order to use a generative AI tool, you don't necessarily have to have any domain knowledge to engage with it. So the barrier to using these tools is very different. The second difference, a calculator won't explain to you how to use it while you're using it. They're a very transactional tool. You put some stuff into it, you get an output, and off you go. Right? It's the kind of thing that won't give you instructions on how to use it while you're using it. Generative AI will. What I want to give you a sense of is the different ways in which we can use technology in learning. Right? We'll start with the simplest one here. So we can either offload or we can extend. We can either do this at an individual level, in which case the technology is kind of like a tool, or we can do this in a more collaborative sense. Right? So as I was just saying, a technology that operates more like a peer. What we tend to do with a calculator is that we just offload. I put my calculation into the machine, I get the response, and I go about my day. Right? It's transactional. Now, you can use generative AI like that. Now, if we think about a technology that we're using like a tool, if we're using it to extend our capabilities, this is different, but it's different in important ways. So if I'm going to use a technology to extend what I'm doing, I'm allowing the technology to create more capacity for me to be able to do something. Subtle but important distinction there between those two. Okay, so now if we think about what this looks like when we have a technology that works more like a collaborator or a peer, when we offload, what we're doing here is that we're allowing the machine to help guide us through the task. All right, so that's why we call this a co-regulation. What we mean by that is that I'm working together with the machine as a collaborator to get the task done in a cooperative way. Now, for that third group, What was interesting is that their use is integrated into a whole lot of different ways in which they're currently learning, with them at the center and then all of these other resources around them. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. So let's say our student in the middle here is stuck. Right? They're stuck on something in their learning and they're not quite sure how to move forward. Right? They don't quite understand a particular concept or other. What many of the students told us is that the first place they will go is to AI, because they generally get a very clear explanation of what it is that they're trying to understand. However, they also know that generative AI isn't always right. So again, what some of these students who are really good at doing this told us is that the next place they go is to the internet, right, to check. What was interesting from there is that a lot of students also told us that they still like video resources, podcasts, multimedia. What you get from a generative AI is often, not always, but often text-based. This is obviously provides opportunities for visuals and various other ways of, more deeply understanding what it is that you're trying to understand. There is a point beyond this where this starts to get interesting. And again, you can think about whether this relates to you, where the students that we spoke to told us that they no longer want to interact with the technology, they want to interact with a human. The interaction with the machine just wasn't satisfying, wasn't helpful, and they needed to test their knowledge in some way with another human, right? My point here is that everything that we have come to understand about the students who are good at doing this, it's not about how well they understand the machine. What mattered is that these students were good learners first. Good learners first, then became good at using AI because they were able to fit it into all of the other resources that they had around them that were helping with their learning. A lot of students also told us that they use AI to make learning easier, to make learning faster. Kind of like an e-bike. You can go faster, it'll be easier, but you're not going to get fit. One of the really important things that we've learned is that the learning that matters is hard. Right? So education is kind of like going to a personal trainer. It's not like Netflix, right? You can't pay your money and get learning. Right? Learning is a partnership between us as teachers and you as students. And what we're trying to do is help you to get fitter in your mind. The World Economic Forum a few weeks ago released a report, and they said essentially that the greatest skill that you can have in the age of AI is to be a good self-regulated learner, because we're going to all have to keep learning, relearning, unlearning, learning more as this goes on, because things are changing so rapidly. We have to accept that hard work is often unpleasant. Hard mental work is unpleasant. Right? Is there anybody here who likes getting on a rowing machine and sitting on that for an hour and pulling on that? Some people like that, but usually they're pretty fit to start with. Right? In the same way that many of us will avoid having to do hard work to get fit, we also tend to avoid to do the hard work of learning. It's very similar. So what we're often told, and the messages that we get, either explicitly or implicitly, that if you find something difficult, if you get confused about something, it means you're not good enough, right? It means you can't do it. That's not true. We've done lots of work on this. What confusion tells us is that you are actually invested enough in the area to get confused in the first place, and you cannot have an aha moment, right? That's one of the most fun things you can have when you're learning. Oh, I get this now. You don't get that unless you're confused first. It doesn't happen, right? So those two things, one of the most powerful things that you can experience while you're learning, requires you to be confused first. What do I mean about being a self-regulated learner? Whenever you're learning, there's kind of two parallel processes going on. One is that you're actually doing the basic learning stuff, the thing that we always focus on. I'm trying to learn this concept or this idea. Right? I'm trying to get this task done. Well, whatever you're doing that, you are also constantly looking at how you're going, making some sense of how you're going, and then making some decisions about where do I need to go next. There is a metacognitive level that we would say is existing on top of that. You need to make a judgment about how you're going, and then you need to decide where you're going to go next, right? Now, this can go wrong. So let's say you might have done this, I've done this, right? Just one day I had this kind of thing in my head. It was like, how do volcanoes work? I don't know. Let's find out. So I read a Wikipedia page. It was very clear. It had lots of pictures. It was really amazing. And by the end of it, I thought that I was an expert in volcanoes. I wasn't. I had no idea, right? So while the learning had happened, the way in which I understood my level of learning wasn't aligned, right? There was a misalignment there. So the better we get at this, the better our learning is. If you think about what an expert is in whatever area it is that you're studying, an expert isn't just somebody who knows a lot. They also know what they don't know. Right? That's what it means to be a good learner. It's really important. So you're making good judgments about how you're progressing. You make good decisions about where to go next. That a lot of people are telling us that they like the way that AI explains things. Right? What it's not so good at doing is things like evaluating stuff, making sense of things, which is what we mean by inference. So making sense of things in the world. And it's not very good at all at regulating itself because it doesn't have a metacognition, right? It's not a conscious being. You have a metacognition. That's one of your superpowers.